So today we're talking about watermelon moments versus seed moments. And we're going to read a story. If you're familiar with the Little House on the Prairie series, we're going to read a true story written by Rose, the daughter, that is played in the series. And what I love about this memoir is the way that the writer chooses to describe the moments that happen in this personal narrative. So I want you to keep a lookout for that. But I also, as I read through, I want you to pay attention to maybe things the author assumed you knew, because this is written in the way past. She's writing at about a moment from 1894, so there might be some references or some language that you don't recognize. But the other piece that we want to focus on is what's the big watermelon moment versus the seed moment that inspired this personal narrative. And I like to think about that as like a snapshot, a picture. So I'm going to read this aloud to you, and feel free to mark it up on your own copy. Rose Wilder Lane was the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the Little House on the Prairie book series in 1894 when Rose was 7. The family left the South Dakota farm where they were struggling to survive. They traveled by covered wagon to new territory in Missouri, where they had bought a cabin from an earlier settler. The events Rose describes here happen moments after the family finally arrives at the cabin. They have just spent the last of their money on food. So this is a great background statement because it gives us that watermelon moment. It gives us the big moment, which is their travel across the country to this point. And then I think to myself, is arriving at the cabin the seed moment, or maybe it's more like the rind, the next big picture moment, and there's going to be some smaller moments in. So let's get in here and find out. My father and mother were talking about things over the wagon's opened end gate. We would eat supper outdoors and sleep one more night in the wagon. My mother meant to scrub that cabin floor from top to bottom before we moved into it. We could still see well enough in the shadowy daylight, but inside the wagon it was too dark to find things. My father rummaged for the lantern. He pressed the spring that lifted its thick glass globe. He touched the match flame to the wick and carefully lowered the globe into its place. And suddenly the lantern was shining in the darkness. He held it up, looking for a place to hang it. And there, in the edge of its light, stood a strange man. Right? So we have some suspense building here. And I also love the description of lighting the lantern, showing it rather than just saying, and my father lit the lantern. The man's feet were bare. His pants were patched over patches and torn. He was tall, thin, bony, and his eyes glittered from a bush of hair and whiskers. I love that description. He came a step nearer, and quick as a snake, my mother's hand slid into the pocket while her revolver was. She waited, ready. Slowly, my father said, "Hello there." Right? Notice that dialogue, that small piece of dialogue. The man said he wanted work. He was looking for a chance for something to eat. My father answered that we were just moving in. As he could see, we didn't have any work to give anybody. Too bad, but maybe better luck in town, just over the next hill, not much more than a mile to the west. And if you remember from the background, this family, Rose's family, they have just spent their last money on food. Maybe the dad's feeling a little nervous there. "You got a good place here," the man said. He was bony, but big. After a minute, my father said it would be a good place someday, he guessed. Then we all stood silent as if we couldn't move. It's interesting how she doesn't use dialogue in here and just kind of describing what everybody's saying. The man began to talk quietly, slowly, almost dreamily. They had to get something to eat, he said. His wife and 5 children were down in the wagon by the creek. They had been traveling all summer looking for work. They could not go on any longer. This was the third day they'd had nothing to eat. He had to get work, so he came up the wagon tracks. They couldn't go on without something to eat. And if you're starting to feel, empathetic or sympathetic toward him, that's exactly what the writer's doing, right? She's building that emotion, and that's part of a personal narrative. That's part of your job as the writer. He stopped. There was nothing more to say, nothing to do. Now I knew what happened when you had nothing to eat. What happens is nothing. Oh, I love that repetition in there, that again and again. Suddenly, my father was talking and moving quickly. Not deliberate at all. I'm a little confused by that. He said he needed help making wood. Provided the man could come help him tomorrow, he'd divide what little. He was reaching into the wagon. At sight of the slab of salted fat pork, my mother cried out, "Manly, no! We've got Rose!" He paid no attention. Look at that powerful dialogue that was put in there, so we really feel that emotion of the mom. The butcher's knife in his hand cut through the white meat. He opened a corner of the sack and poured cornmeal into the little tin pail. He was asking, did the man have a good axe? He said they'd start early at sunup, put in a good day's work, and if the wood sold, he'd treat the man right. Bring an axe if he had one. Be sure to bring back the pail. That's all right. Don't mention it. See you tomorrow. Again, that's the dad speaking, right? And she's writing in first person, but it's a third person perspective. The man was gone into the darkness. He had not said a word. Afterward, my mother always said that she expected never to see that vagabond again, nor her tin pail either. At the time, she said nothing. My father made the fire under the camp stove, and she cooked supper. We had fried salt pork and corn dodgers and slept in the wagon. Oh, that's right, her mom wants to clean the cabin. The man woke us in the false dawn, bringing the tin pail and his axe. He was a better woodsman than my father. All that day while my mother and I cleaned the house and lugged things from the wagon to put on the dry scrub floor, they worked in the woods. They worked as long as they could see. Then my mother held the lantern, and they took the top curtains off the wagon and stacked up high in it all the stove wood that it would hold. So now you're going to go back and you're going to think about, again, what's the big watermelon moment for Rose? And then what scene in the story, probably a very descriptive one, do you think was the seed moment, the snapshot that she held in her mind that inspired this personal narrative? What is the moment that the rest of the narrative is written around? All right, good luck.